So I have a file that I've created. The name of the file, I've called it as hoisting.js. Now, basically, hoisting is a mechanism where variables and function declarations are moved to the top of their scope before code execution. Now, you need to keep in mind that when you talk about variables, it's only the variables declared with the var keyword. Now, let's see this in action to understand it better. Now, let us say that I have a variable called as first name, and I will assign my name to it. This could, you can go ahead and write your first name there. We've gone ahead, declared and assigned a value to our variable. If I access the value on the next line, if I do console.log first name, it works, right? Because I've declared a variable and then I'm using that particular variable. But what happens is when you declare a variable with the var keyword, you can actually access that particular variable even before you technically declaring it. So what has happened is on line number 6, I've declared and assigned a value to our variable. Line number 7 and onwards, if I use it, it makes sense. I have access to that particular variable. But if you see, if I try to access the variable on line number 5, and if the variable is declared with var, it is still accessible. The reason because variables declared with the var keyword gets hoisted. So what does that mean? It means to say that whenever we execute our file, just before it starts interpreting line by line. JavaScript is an interpreted programming language. It will get executed line by line. Just before it starts executing line by line, it will move all the variable declarations above to the scope. And again, this is the second time we are coming across the term scope. So what it will do, it will move it above the scope. You need to keep in mind it's only the declaration that gets moved and not the value associated with it. That means to say, if I now run this particular file node hoisting.js, so what's going to happen is I'm able to access my variable even before declaring it. Is it a good thing? No. You generally want to avoid bugs and to avoid issues, you generally would want to access your variable after having declared it. That is the best programming practice. But this is something that happens while you're working with JavaScript. And you need to be aware of it. You need to be careful about it. So you can see that I'm able to access the variable first name. It did not throw me an error. It never said that, hey, this variable does not exist. If you try to do the same with, let's say, Python, it would have thrown an error. It would have said that, okay, on line number 5, I do not know what the variable first name is. Because before coming to line number 5, nothing above it had a variable declaration called as first name. In any other programming language you take, if you take C++ or Java, when it is a compiled language, Python, JavaScript as interpreted. So there what will happen is it will not even run the file. Just before you do the compilation of your code, it will immediately throw an error and tell you that, hey, you cannot be doing this. There's no variable declared called as first name. But that's not the case with JavaScript, right? What happens is if you come back to declaring the variable with the let keyword, remember what we spoke about the differences. Variables with the var keyword gets hoisted, let and const do not get hoisted. That means to say, though if I declare a variable with let, it is not going to move to the top of our scope. So if I run the same file, you can see that it now throws me a reference error. Check this out. It says reference error, cannot access first name before initialization. Initialization is you're declaring and assigning an initial value to it. Now, the reason why this did not work is because variables declared with the let and const keywords do not get hoisted. So the same thing happens if I try to do it with my const. When I try to do that, it says reference error, cannot access first name before initialization. We still continue to get the same error. Now, we've come to realize that more and more moving forward, we are going to be using const and let, and we'll try to avoid usage of the var keyword. But remember what I told you right at the beginning. You need to know the ES5 features, and you also need to know the ES6 features, because this is something that was usually going to get asked to you during the interviews. Now, even maybe in the project, you might still be doing ES6 throughout, but still, this understanding is very, very important, right? Okay, so what I'll do now is let me bring up the whiteboard, and we'll try to understand this in a very pictorial manner as to what's happening. Okay, cool. So let's go back to declaring this as var itself. I'll just tidy this up. Okay. So what we had here was, you need to keep in mind that when you create a file, there is basically a scope that is getting created. That's called as the global scope. That is the life of the variable. Where within your program does the variable reside? So there are different terms for scopes. There is global, there is function, and then there is block. So overall, there are three different types. There is global, there is function, there is block. Global is basically your entire file or the main function. So what is happening here is on line number 6, I am declaring a variable called as first name, and I'm assigning a value to it, which is fine. And on line number 7, I'm doing a console.log of the first name. Technically speaking, let's think about it for a second. That line number 5 does not exist. So we just declared the variable first name. I assigned it to Ani. And then I'm doing a console.log of first name. And yes, it's going to go ahead and print Ani for us. But what do we say? We say that variables declared with the var keyword, they get hoisted. That means to say, just before each line of code gets executed, JavaScript will scan through this entire file and look for variables declared with the var keyword or function declarations. We'll get to function declarations later when we learn the functions part of it. But let's say it'll start looking for variables declared with the var keyword. So what this is going to do is, it'll take that particular variable. All right, it's going to take that particular variable alone, not its assignment, and move it to the top of the scope. Right now, in what scope are we in? We are in the global scope. I could also be within the function. If I do the same thing inside a function, then I'm inside a function scope. Even there, it'll move it to the top. So because it is moving only the variable declarations to the top, what will then happen? In case you have code like var fn. I'm sorry, let's do this. Let me just clear this out. So the variable fn is moved to the top of the scope. And then we have line number 5, where I'm doing console.log of fn. So anyway, the variable declaration has been moved, not its assignment. So what have we learned in JavaScript? When you have a variable declared and you do not give it an initial value, what is the value of that particular variable? It's undefined. Yes or no? That's what we learned in the variables first section. The first video, that's what we learned. You declare a variable, you don't give it any kind of a value to it. By default, the value is undefined. Now, guess what do we get the value here? I'll now run the file. You can see it is undefined. Does it make sense? Yeah. That is the reason why here it now says undefined. Here it prints as Ani. That's what is happening with hoisting.